everyone, really, who allowed me to come here and give this paper. Very selfishly, it's sort of a promotion of my upcoming book, and if you go on the Institute's website, you can find the cover and the introduction in the proofs. The book will be printed, if all goes well, in April 2024 with McGill Queen's University Press, but you have a sneak peek if you want to read a little bit of it. It's not exactly the same as this paper. I wanted to give more of a broad overview in this paper, but that is probably more informative for looking at Fichte's late period and kind of what happens generally in German philosophy around 1800 and how there's a sort of a turn around the turn of the century that happens. But more generally today I wanted to talk about what is the Wissenschaftslehre. This is Fichte's name for his system that begins in really 1792, 1793, but takes off at the University of Jena in 1794. I don't want to talk for too long, so I'll just jump into the paper. You all have a handout, I hope, and that has the most pertinent quotations on it, and when the time comes, I'll indicate what's on the handout. So, what is the Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte's Berlin philosophy? To the very end, Fichte insisted that his philosophy never changed. And while his main theoretical work, the Wissenschaftslehre, was rewritten some 17 times over the course of 20 years, its title remained the same. Even the most superficial comparison of the content of Fichte's works yields a contradiction. The different versions of the Wissenschaftslehre are vastly different in both style and substance. Relating any given version to the one that precedes it or succeeds it is always difficult. But one moment in particular resists interpretation. From 1794 to 1799, Fichte was professor at the University of Jena and produced 2 series of lectures on the Wissenschaftslehre. The first one is the canonical version that most of us study when we study the history of philosophy, the 1794 foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, the Grundlage der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre. And parenthetically, in 2021, Daniel Briesel, who's a very important American Fichte scholar, produced a beautiful new English translation. So for those who are hesitant about wading into Fichte's German, there's a really beautiful new critical edition English translation that's available. It is, the 1794 version, in brief, a transcendental philosophy meant to continue and correct that of Immanuel Kant. One could summarize its goal as attempting to reconcile freedom and necessity in view of giving an account of human subjectivity. It does so through negotiating the relationships of an I, an Ich, and a not I, a Nicht-Ich. This so-called subjective idealism was radically transformed when Fichte left for Berlin in 1799. The Übergang, or transition from Jena to Berlin, will see Fichte abandon all of the key terms developed in Jena. Gone is the I, and in its place stands imperiously the Absolute. Nor are the arguments the same. The Jena Wissenschaftslehre follows a strict transcendental method in order to provide a foundation for intellectual spontaneity. The different versions of the Berlin Wissenschaftslehre are usually some sort of Zurückführung or Zurückziehung, a tracing back of the many forms of being to the one absolute. What then are we to make of Fichte's claim that his work did not change? I would like to suggest that the key to understanding this problem does not lie in comparing different versions, but rather in looking for the essence of the Wissenschaftslehre, or to use Fichte's terms, its peculiarity, its Eigentümlichkeit. To that end, I would like to posit 5 theses about the Wissenschaftslehre, and this should be at the top of your handout on the first page. Number 1, the Wissenschaftslehre is the product of an insight. Number 2, it is an insight into an activity, the subjective act of knowing. Number 3, the active nature of the insight means that one can only understand it by performing it for oneself. The Wissenschaftslehre is an exercise, not a text. Number 4, this exercise can only be performed in language. but talking about the insight discursively in language is an objectification that leads us away from the insight. This means that the presuppositions of language must be integrated into the exercise. And finally, 5, this in turn means that to ask the question, what is the Wissenschaftslehre, is already to be doing it. Applying my 5 theses would mean that each version of the Wissenschaftslehre is a performance, a repetition with a difference. Each version is motivated by different concerns, applying the insight to a different problem and a different audience. In Jena, these were questions of transcendental subjectivity as it relates to the concepts of finitude, so in 1794, and infinitude in the Novo Metodo, 1796 to 1799. In Berlin, the questions are those of reconciling knowing and being in an absolute principle by means of its appearance, its Erscheinung. I would like to suggest that the role of language in explaining the insight eluded Fichte up until Berlin. Specifically, I believe that it is resolved in the 1804 version, perhaps the most speculative of them all. In the time that remains, I would like to historically validate my 5 theses in 2 steps. First, in exploring the origins of this insight. Second, in examining its form in 1804. So, first part, Fichte's insight. And here we jump ahead a little bit. In the preface to his 1806 lectures on the philosophy of religion, the Anweisung zum seligen Leben, Fichte wrote that these lectures, so these lectures on religion from 1806, were the result of 6 or 7 years of mature meditation on the philosophical insight that had occurred to him 13 years earlier, in the fall of 1793. So what is this insight that occurs in 1793, mentioned much later in Berlin in 1806? By 1793, Fichte was already an astute reader of Kant and Reinhold, and author of An Attempt at a Critique of All Revelation, 1792, a book that had been mistaken for a 4th critique by Kant. Afterwards, Fichte undertook a thorough study of G. E. Schulze's Enesidimus. It is his engagement with Schulze that provides the occasion for Fichte's insight to occur. Early in the year 1792, Gottlob Ernst Schulze, professor of philosophy at the now defunct University of Helmstedt, anonymously published a book called Enesidimus, or Concerning the Foundations of the Elementary Philosophy propounded in Jena by Professor Reinhold, including a defense of skepticism against the pretensions of the critique of reason. Try to give a book a title like that today. The long-winded title explains its contents quite well. In it, 2 fictional philosophers exchange letters. A so-called critical philosopher, a disciple of Immanuel Kant like Reinhold, is called Hermias. Enesidimus, who takes his name from an ancient Greek skeptic, is a disciple of David Hume. The book systematically dismantles Kant's transcendental philosophy, contending that it does not overcome Humean skepticism. Schulze's skeptical arguments are strong, and Fichte, the young Kantian, felt that everything he held to be true was under attack. Fichte had been asked to review the book, and the resulting text would prove to be programmatic, containing the insight that grounds the Wissenschaftslehre. Fichte is convinced that the answers to Schulze are already to be found in the Critique of Pure Reason. Critical philosophy would have to be shown to contain within itself its own foundational first principle. Once the conditions for thinking it, the foundational principle, are put in place, it would then arise on its own, having the same self-evident truth as a geometrical theorem once the figure that illustrates it has been drawn. Fichte's insight from the fall of 1793 was therefore an insight into the foundational principle of transcendental philosophy, one that is self-evident and indubitable, routing Schulze's objections. In brief, and here comes the insight, Fichte's insight is that thought is an activity that always belongs to an I, to self-consciousness, and that in the activity of thinking, recognition of the I will emerge. The I is therefore the foundational principle, but only when properly understood. As Fichte will write at the beginning of the 1794 Wissenschaftslehre, the foundational principle, or Grundsatz, is an activity to be performed rather than the object of a proof, emerging in its activity. It must therefore always have some objective content. When one engages in the activity that is objective knowing out there, something else arises, concomitant with the object. Yet this foundational principle cannot lead us to some fact apart from the consciousness in which it is present. The I does not posit some objectified principle outside of itself. Rather, it, quote, posits itself through its own activity, unquote. This is the famous Setzen of the Wissenschaftslehre. To speak of a foundational principle at all, apart from the I and its activity, is to illegitimately place it outside of the subjective conditions of knowing, the error that Reinhold unwittingly made and that renders his system untenable. Schulze had swept away Reinhold's artificial construction, and now transcendental philosophy required a new foundation. Because knowing always has a material and discursive element, something akin to a construction is necessary. Hence, Fichte speaks of a foundational principle as isolated from the normal unified act of knowing. But crucial to the proper understanding of this principle is that its constructive activity, the discursive side of it that generates objects in consciousness via judgment, is in fact the same activity that manifests itself as an oblique self-recognition. Fichte reconciles these two aspects by means of the neologism Tathandlung, or fact act. Fichte is at pains to put into words something that he grasps intuitively. Beginning in 1794, he is compelled to write down this insight, especially in order to provide a visual aid to his students. But the Wissenschaftslehre, which is the exploration of this insight, was never really conceived of as a written text. In almost all of its versions, it is a series of lectures. Any published notes are, as Fichte said in 1794, notes for my listeners, eine Handschrift für meine Zuhörer. These notes, therefore, do not constitute a treatise or dead letter, but a Lehre, or teaching, in which the students themselves would perform what was to be learned. It was, Fichte wrote, a Wissenschaftslehre, hence the name, not philosophy, but Wissenschaftslehre, a Lehre that we perform. If one simply does what Fichte suggests one do, the insight into the activity of the I should emerge on its own. If one reads Fichte's account of his own insight in this light, what he means comes into sharper focus. Knowing is pure activity. This activity is always contained by a particular act of knowing, a subject performing an act of judgment. Whenever I perform an act of judgment, I am certain beyond all doubt that I have indeed performed such an activity. The coincidence of my knowing and my awareness of knowing is an indubitable foundation that even Schulze could not deny, lest he contradict himself. This indubitability is not the product of my subjectivity, but instead is an activity into which my subjective particular consciousness inserts itself. In summary, Fichte's insight is no self-consciousness without consciousness, and vice versa. Every act of knowing, therefore, has two aspects, the material and the self-referential. There is no knowledge possible without some external object. But whenever an object is known, something else appears, obliquely, in the background. This other thing is the self that knows. It can never be seen as an object, but only in the flash of activity that is knowledge. Said otherwise, I am continually catching myself in the act of knowing. In the Jena period, Fichte articulates this point most clearly in one of the lectures from the Wissenschaftslehre Novo Methodo, so near the end of his second series in Jena, and this is one of the quotes on your handout. Think the concept I. So this is Fichte trying to get his students to perform the exercise. Think the concept I, and think of yourself as you do this. Everyone understands what this means. Everyone thinks of something thereby. One feels one's consciousness to be determined in a particular manner, and it is by virtue of this that one is conscious of something specific. Now one must observe what one does when one thinks of this concept. Think of any object at all, the wall, for example, or the stove. The thinking subject is a rational being, but in thinking of this object, this freely thinking subject forgets about itself and pays no attention to its own free activity. With the same freedom with which I think about the wall, now I think about the I. I am also thinking about something when I think about the I. And here's the key part. But in this case, the thinking subject and the object of thought cannot be distinguished from each other in the way they could be while I was thinking about the wall. The thinking subject and the object one is thinking of, the thinker and the thought, are here one and the same. So that is the Jena period and the foundational insight. And of course my claim is that while the expression will change radically, the fundamental insight will change and be performed in a different way. And so we'll jump right to 1804 now, and this is the next quote on your handout. And you see Fichte does in Berlin, 7-8 years later, almost exactly the same thing. So compare the above quotation from the Jena Wissenschaftslehre to the following from 1804. To begin with, we can demonstrate immediately that knowing can actually appear as something standing on its own. I ask you to look sequentially at your own inner experience. If you remember it accurately, you will find the object and its representation with all their modifications. But now I ask further. Do you not know in all these modifications? And is not your knowing as knowing the same self-identical knowing in all variations of the object? End quote. So the same sort of thought experiment, asking the listeners to juxtapose thinking and awareness of thinking as they are thinking, is used again and again and again in the subsequent versions of the Wissenschaftslehre, all the way up to its final unfinished version in 1813, where the example of the stove from the 1790s returns. In the subjective language of the earlier Jena Wissenschaftslehre, this was expressed as the intellectual activity of an I, as it is limited, so this famous Anstoß, before what is not I. But the I's very activity of integrating what it is not into what it is takes precedence over the I. The foundational principle of the Wissenschaftslehre was therefore never the I, but always the Tathandlung, the activity that sees consciousness and self-consciousness, thinking and awareness of thinking, come together. But how does one build an entire systematic philosophy out of such a simple and abstract insight? Key to understanding this is realizing that the Wissenschaftslehre is a transcendental philosophy, and I believe it always remains a transcendental philosophy, even if it doesn't look that way. And indeed, the 1804 Wissenschaftslehre will prove to be a protracted transcendental argument. Put succinctly, it portrays the Wissenschaftslehre as a transcendental deduction of self-reflexivity. It ultimately proves that experience is self-indexed. And we can talk about that later. There are great examples that we can bring up in the discussion later. We can talk about what happens when you look at a painting, what happens when you reflect on art, when you reflect on things that are removed from your own inner experience. But to say that experience is self-indexed is to say it carries with it its own criteria for interpretation. That's not as complicated as it sounds. It basically means that we must establish a logical foundation for all true propositions and then integrate the speaking subject into those propositions. The what of consciousness and the that of self-consciousness need to be shown to be in cooperation, dynamically. Whenever I say something, there must be a logical agreement, that is, absence of contradiction, between what I say, the content, and the manner in which I say it, the form. At various points in his career, Fichte will call this the relationship between effected and effectuation, which he does in the Enesidemus review, the identity of form and matter, which comes up at different points later on, or in his popular works, simply not being in contradiction with oneself, as is the case in the 3 series of lectures on the vocation of the scholar that he does at every university where he teaches. So in 1804, it is called the agreement between saying, sagen, and doing, tun. And Fichte explains this in 1804 in the 19th lecture, and this is also in your handout, which is probably on the page over, and this, I think, is the key quotation to understanding the structure of the 1804 Wissenschaftslehre. Someday I'm going to retranslate those 1804 lectures because the English is a little rough, but the German is also a little difficult too. So, Fichte writes in 1804, I say, in all derivative knowing, or in appearance, a pure absolute contradiction exists between enactment, tun, and saying, sagen, propositio facto contraria. That's Fichte's Latin. Let me add here, by the way, as I thought previously on an appropriate occasion, a thoroughgoing skepticism must base itself on just this, and give voice to this ineradicable contradiction in mere consciousness. The very simple refutation of all systems that do not elevate themselves to pure reason, i.e., their dismissal and the presentation of their insufficiency even though their originator is not thereby improved, is based on just the fact that one points out the contradiction between what they assert in their principles and what they actually do in asserting them. So what does that mean? A proposition in which what is said is incompatible with its being articulated falls into performative self-contradiction. The carrying out of the proposition must not invalidate its content. This becomes clearer if we consider that propositions are always expressed in 2 moments, the first implicit, the second explicit. So when the skeptic, for example Schulze, says there is no truth, this is the explicit objective part of the proposition X is Y. But a judgment such as this one is always the judgment of someone in particular, so that's the transcendental part, even if judgments do not require the speaker for their content to be true. So hence the transcendental nature of the subject, not the cause, but the possibility condition. Later, Fichte will express this relationship between transcendental subjects and the propositions they express with the phrase, if being is a self-construction, then we are the beings who do this self-construction. Concretely, this means that every expression of a proposition can be preceded by the phrase, I say it is the case that, or I say it is true that. This yields the expanded form. For example, the skeptic's claim that there is no truth is ultimately, I say it is true that there is no truth. In this case, the implied performative aspect of the proposition, I say it is true that, contradicts its content, there is no truth. It is therefore a test of the validity of an argument to see whether the I say it is true that does not contradict the claims of the proposition. Much of the argument of the 1804 Wissenschaftslehre is consecrated to making the case that it is implicit in the first part of the argument, I say it is true that, must be integrated into the argument, but precisely as something implicit. It can never come into the foreground, always staying in the background. The reason, of course, is that self-consciousness cannot know itself as an object, but only obliquely, catching itself, as it were, in the act of knowing. The I that stands in the background is not my subjectivity, nor is it even a subjective condition in Kant's sense. It is the possibility condition of the meeting of subject and object in an act of knowing. The subject being something that manifests itself in the act of knowing. We can talk about how this comes out of Kant later if you want. This is why in 1804 Fichte speaks of subjectivity as we, or as repetition. instead of, you know, I, and this I that must accompany all of my representations as in Kant. The concrete act of knowing, in which subject and object emerge, is an image. The absolute, the transcendental possibility conditions of all knowledge, is the thing of which it is an image. This does not mean that concrete knowing is a copy of something, of some other concrete thing, but rather that knowledge has an image of structure. So, by way of conclusion, because I know at the end that was a lot of material, I'd like to summarize the main points of my argument on the Wissenschaftslehre from 1794 to 1804 as so corollaries above. And this is the last part of your handout. These shouldn't be matched up with the propositions, so one-to-one with the propositions and corollaries, but rather as sort of another sort of renewed set of 5 remarks we can make at the end, summarizing. So, 1. The basic insight of the Wissenschaftslehre is that consciousness and self-consciousness always accompany each other in the act of knowing. Knowledge, therefore, always has a material element, the sensible object that is known, and a formal element, the I that knows. 2. I am aware of the formal elements of my own thinking as I know a particular object, insofar as I know that I am the one who is thinking whenever I think a particular object. 3. Logically, this can be expressed as an agreement between the saying of something, sagen, and what is said, tun. The validity of a proposition can be evaluated on the basis of whether the proposition does what it says. Otherwise, it falls into self-contradiction. Testing tun-sagen agreement implies invoking a subject. For example, there is no truth is, in its full transcendental structure, I say it is true that there is no truth. 5. The transcendental presuppositions that structure a proposition must remain in the background. Their presuppositional character, that which is unsaid in relation to what is said, must remain in the background, since awareness of knowing, to self-consciousness, can never be an object for consciousness. So, those are my concluding 5 points. Thank you.